experience, Jackson Snyder presents. We will examine the life of our Master Yeshua by discovering his ancestors, family, and friends, by reviewing rare ancient manuscripts, and speaking to those who know him best. From the Vero Essene Yahad, now experience, Jackson Snyder presents.
Now, welcome back, my friends, or as we say in old country, Tonight we have Brother Snyder all by himself, giving us the second episode in the series on the rare Slavonic version of Josephus' Jewish War. We understand that the Slavonic version is actually a translation into Slavonic or Old Russian of the lost version of Josephus' War that he wrote in Aramaic just for Jews in dispersion, and something he wrote that he did not want Greeks or Romans to understand. And so when he wrote the Greek version, he took them out. In the first episode, Josephus talks about the wild man, the wonder worker, and the later history of those who followed the wonder worker. And I don't need to give you their names, because yes, I know you have already guessed. So if you missed that first episode of the Josephus War that nobody knows, you can find it real fast at this link, jacksonsnyder.podbean.com. He has some of his best stuff now up at Podbean. That's Podbean, because now each episode he received from Podbean a can of bean, a can of pod. At least he gets something for doing this. On the other hand, I get nothing. I did get paid one time for working in a situation like this. The people were so appreciative that they gave me a home-canned case of chitterlings, or as they would say, chitlins. I was very thankful, of course, and it wasn't until I ate an entire can of it, a mason jar, I should say, that I found out what it was. Obvious I don't eat that anymore anyway. It's the consistency of snot. Since then, I've gone vegetarian, and they have a great imitation of vegetable chitterling made out of groat clusters, fortified lentils, and organic cannon towels. No, you can barely tell a difference. So before I make you laugh yourself to sleep, let's go to episode 2 and Josephus' Slavonic War of the Jews.
This is part 2 of Slavonic Josephus. The last week, we did the Wonder Worker and the Wild Man, and then we looked a little bit about the Jesus movement after the resurrection. And we discovered that there is a lot of information in that Slavonic Aramaic version that we just was not aware of before. And for some reason, the scholars want to negate that text. They want to see it buried. It's so difficult to try to get an English translation of it. You try to get a Slavonic translation. Very hard. We talked last week about Kirill and Methodius and a theory on how this Aramaic version of Josephus' War ended up in Slavonic in Eastern Europe to be later discovered in about 1860 and eventually translated in English about 70 years later. Try to find it. Well, I finally found it. I've been looking for it for a long time. time. And what I found was a PDF of the Slavonic Josephus War, along with interlinear, or I should say interpaginated with the regular war that we're familiar with. I'm sorry, I had somebody on my phone there. And there are vast differences. And it looks like to me that Josephus writing to the Jews in Aramaic, especially those in the dispersion, it was like almost like an outline of the Greek version that came later for the Romans. And information like we did last week is missing from the popular Greek version. Now, of course, that would lead skeptical scholars to tell us that the Slavonic version really is nothing but a forgery. But I never thought so. And now looking at the synoptic version of the two together, I am sure that it's not. And what I want to do is to put together a PDF for people that want to read the Slavonic version, including all the information that's in there about our faith in the first century history of not only the Roman Empire, but also Israel, and right down to the people that we have to deal with. Flavius Josephus, he was born in 37. So we're getting a contemporaneous view of the history of that time. And he died sometime around 96. We just really don't know when, but I suspect that his adopted brother Domitian had him executed because so many in his family were converting over to Roman Christianity at that time. And Domitian, of course, considered himself the Lord and God and was to be addressed that way. And he was a worshiper of Minerva. His idea was to bring the faith of Minerva to the entire Roman Empire so that they would have one God, or really one goddess. So the Christians he rounded up, including his, as I mentioned, his family, and he had several of the people of the imperial group murdered as well for one reason or the other, under the guise of them taking up a foreign superstition that included, I believe, like I said, Josephus, but also we find Epaphroditus being executed at that time, and also Clement of Rome, the fellow that we consider was used to write the journals of Peter in the Clementine recognitions and homilies. So here we go. We're going to start out in Ptolemy's. And one thing that you might want to do if you're really interested in this is I read these passages. You might want to go out and take a look at some maps and pictures on the internet at the same time. Ptolemy's. Today, I think that it's known as Akko, or yes, Akko. In Crusade times, it was called Acre, and it was a Crusader fortress that the Crusaders finally lost, of course. It was a very fortified place. Now, at this time, it was called Ptolemy's after the king of Egypt, Alexander's general, Ptolemy. That's Ptolemais. It's a town in Galilee, as Josephus tells us, built upon the seacoast on a great plain surrounded by mountains. Galilee is on the eastern flank, 60 stadies away. That's about 7.5 miles. Remember, this whole area of Israel at that time, and this was a very, very small slice of land, even smaller than the Florida Panhandle. Close by, there's a town and a river called Bellius. Nearby is the tomb of Memnon. Located there is a deep round depression. When the wind blows, the sand in it becomes glass. And though many boats come, it does not run short, for there is ceaseless wind that blows the sand in and fills it up. Then when it brims over, the wind returns the glass to its former place. Then it becomes sand again. An interesting little side note about Ptolemy's. By the way, that's just slightly north of Carmel, Mount Carmel, where you see on Israel's western coast a little notch, about 3/4 of the way up, a little notch there. We have Mount Carmel and Ptolemy's, and a little farther up is Tyre. And not far from there, just a little more than a stone's throw, we have Nazareth and Yotapata and Cana and a lot of other little towns there that are mentioned in the scripture. It's in Upper Galilee. Now, here's a little history for you. Gaius Caesar. Gaius is also called Caligula. That's probably the name that you know him by, but his full name is Gaius Iulius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He sends his envoy Petronius to Ptolemy's. That's why we're starting at Ptolemy's. Caligula lived from 12 to 41. So he was a contemporary with Joshua, and he ruled from 37 to 41 after it is thought that he put the pillow on the head of the aged Tiberius. And the Petronius we're talking about is Publius Petronius, who plays a very big part in Jewish history at this time, as well as his successor, another Petronius that worked for Nero, had a great deal to do with the debacle of the Jewish war. Now, this Petronius was appointed the governor of Syria by Gaius. Now, this area in Israel was considered to be Syria, or actually they called it South Syria. And when I say Gaius, remember I'm talking about Caligula, who was quite mad. He had a chip on his shoulder for the whole world, and there was probably a good reason for that, because his father, who was Germanicus or Germanicus, was very famous and popular in the Roman Empire. And that father had gone, and he was called Germanicus because he conquered Germany with his troops. And so it was almost certain that he would be the next emperor after Tiberius. But Tiberius and another of his cronies, they planned to poison Germanicus, and he was indeed poisoned. Caligula has a sister, several of them actually. One of those sisters was named Agrippina. They call her Agrippina the Younger because Caligula's mother was Agrippina, who was married to Germanicus. Agrippina the Younger feeds into this a little later on in the next session we do. We're going to do 3 sessions here. This is the second one, as I mentioned, in that she married her uncle, who was Emperor Claudius. We'll get a little into Claudius tonight if I ever get there. And now to the Slavonic Josephus passage. After Tiberius came Gaius Caesar. Oh, what I forgot to tell you was Tiberius, in the last 10 years of his reign, he retired unto the Isle of Capri. Capri means goats, Goat Island. And there he had a veritable constant and continuous orgy for a decade. And Caligula was used by Tiberius in some very terrible ways. He was sexually assaulted, forced to do some of Tiberius' dirty work, forced to act out in sexual acts before he had even reached puberty. And finally, Tiberius, if you read Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, you'll read some very horrible things about these guys. But it is thought that Caligula finally put the pillow to his head and killed him, knowing that he was going to be, or he had been named, the successor. After Tiberius came Gaius Caesar, Caligula, who was intoxicated with his own success and deprived the fatherland of noble men, and he extended his inhumanity against the Jews. He sent Petronius with troops against Jerusalem to set up the abomination of his effigy in the temple. Interesting that this very word, abomination, is used here. They say that the abomination that makes desolate is sometime in the future, but most certainly Yeshua was talking about the attempt to put this abomination of his effigy into the temple, and also what was to come up a few years later when they actually did put the abomination in the temple. Another idol that corresponded to the worship of the Caesar. If the Jews prevented it, they were to be killed and the whole nation exterminated. While he was on his way, that is Petronius, news of this reached the Jews. Some gave it credit and were terrified, but others did not credit it. When Petronius arrived at Ptolemais, the Jews met him on the plain with wives and children, imploring him for the sake of the Torah of the fathers and for their own sake. And he spared the people, but he left there his troops. Now, he had 2 legions there. Caligula sent him with 10,000 men to put that effigy into the Jewish temple. Can you see the picture here? The envoy of the emperor comes, and the Jews are already waiting for him, and they lay themselves down and bar their necks and the necks of their families to be slain by the troops troops there rather than to allow the effigy to be put up in their temple against the Torah and for the sake of the Torah. The next step, we must realize that at this time, the Hellenists, that is the Greek Jews, we get an idea that Galilee was a lot of Jews up there, and there were, but half of those Jews or more followed the Greek or Hellenist way, even in their worship. They had forgotten the Torah. They knew nothing about it. That's why Yeshua came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, because after 300 years of Alexandrian rule, these people knew nothing about their religion anymore. Look at this country in the last 50, 60 years. Used to be in the 1950s, you open a church door, it was packed. Now nobody goes. Nobody goes. So in many of the major cities, and even a few of the smaller ones like Pella, the Hellenists did anything they could to stir up the Jews so they could actually fight them and exterminate them. And this happened in many cities, that the Greeks turned on the Jews for one reason or the other. And I think last week I told you one particular incident, maybe I did. If I didn't, it'll be next time, where in a particular synagogue that was owned by a Hellenist and rented to the Jews to run their synagogue, the owner came and set up a brazier and began to sacrifice birds and small animals on it right in front of the synagogue door, which caused an outcry, going so far as the Jews there getting in touch with the governor of Syria to see if this couldn't be stopped. It was a blatant blasphemy in order to stir them up. And that ended up with the Jews being massacred by the Greeks of the city. Now, I'm thinking that was in Caesarea. I could be wrong there, but they had an armed conflict there where the Greek Jews and Gentiles gathered together to actually exterminate the Jewish faction in that town. So Petronius advanced toward Galilee, and he summoned all, threatening them with the power of Rome and the awe of Caesar, again Caligula. And Petronius demonstrated that their plea was vain and useless, since all countries venerated the effigy of Caesar equally with other gods, and they alone opposed this, as if commencing hostility. Now, incidentally, take a look at Revelation 17, which I'll read a little bit of. I don't want to get in too much into Revelation and history, but this is a major point here. Revelation 17:3, then 9 through 11. The visionary writes, "So he carried me away," that is the angel of Yahweh, "in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw," the wilderness, of course, is symbolic for the world of heresy. "And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." Of course, the names of blasphemy were the names of the heads, because all the heads of this blasphemous beast were worshipped, and worshipped primarily all throughout the world as the major gods. And 7 heads with 10 horns. We're just going to talk about the 7 heads right now. "Here's the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." 7 mountains or hills in Rome, 7 also in Jerusalem. This signifies both cities, not one or the other, both. And the abomination of the woman sits atop, or I think if you read it in the actual Greek, it's a little bit more racy than that. So there are also 7 kings or rulers. He says 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th. So there's actually 8 heads on there. And the 8th is of the 7th and is going to perdition. That is destruction. This is pretty easy to count up. These are the first Roman emperors, the first being Octavius, who was called Augustus, first head. Tiberius, the second head. We're speaking of now of Gaius Caligula. He's the 3rd head. Heads after this is Claudius is the next one. Nero is the 5th. Vespasian is the 6th. Remember, Vespasian was a general that came in and destroyed all Israel, then left to take over as emperor from when Nero abdicated, left his son Titus there with the troops to destroy Jerusalem and the temple. So Titus is number 7, and the 8th is his brother. Domitian. Now, how do we know that? Could be just anybody. But we find a definition of when the time was that this was written, or actually, we might say, defines the date that John is writing about. He says, one is, speaking of one king or one ruler. And that one, when we count up, is Vespasian, which dates this writing, or at least what he's writing about, to 70 AD. That's when Vespasian went toward Rome to take over the government, leaving Titus, his son, in command. With, of course, Josephus was there. He was a prisoner of Vespasian, and he became a trusted companion of Titus. That's why, undoubtedly, why the Aramaic Slavonic Josephus was destroyed, because it turned out that the Jews understood him as a turncoat. Josephus was a general in the army and governor of Galilee when this broke out, and when he was captured, rather than being killed in a most heinous, tricky action, he became the slave of Vespasian and Titus and their interpreter. And we read in Josephus's War, the Greek version, the many speeches that he supposedly went and spoke to the Jews within the city of Jerusalem to try to get them to surrender peacefully and save their lives. Now, the eighth head is Titus's brother, Domitian. We know that because it says the eighth is of the seventh. 5 have fallen, one is, and one other has yet to come, and when he comes, he must continue a short time. That's number 7. A short time. Titus only lasted about a year and a half, and it is said that his brother, Domitian, took over the empire after he had locked his brother Titus, who was a great general, in a box full of ice and left him there. So we find that Domitian was of the 7th, the 8th was of the 7th, the 7th lasted a short time, and Domitian ends up, as the 8th, going to perdition. He was the one, of course, that I talked about that had Clement killed and Epaphroditus killed and Josephus killed and many, many more. He was executed in a plot by Clement's wife, who was also his cousin. And there was another character in that plot to kill Domitian, and that was a man named Stephanus or Stephen. And it's quite an exciting thing to read about because they were both believers. I don't know, they must have condoned this murder of this beast because he certainly did go to perdition, and the people who called themselves the people of Yahweh finally saw to it. So we've got a date defined, 70-71 AD, remembering that the last 3 wreaked total destruction, perdition upon the Jews in the day of Yahweh. Whether you believe it or not, that's fine. We'll continue on with the reading. So the people were grieving on account of their Torah and their ancestral customs, since it was improper to set up any image either in the temple or in any ordinary place. Petronius answered them, "It is my duty to protect the image of my master, for if I transgress hostilities against you, if I spare you, then I will justly perish. And the one who sent me, not I, will start the hostility. Like you, I am also carrying out orders." And all the people cried out, "We are ready to accept suffering and torment for the Torah." Petronius subdued their clamor and said, "So, you can fight Caesar?" But they said, "We sacrifice to Elohim twice a day for Caesar and the men of Rome." That sacrifice would quickly end after this. "But if he wishes to set up his effigy in our temple, then he shall first have to slaughter the whole Jewish nation. Now we will prepare our necks for the slitting together with our wives and children." There's where that quote is. Now, hearing this, Petronius was astounded, and he took pity on them, seeing how, in their great courage, they were scornful of death and of all kinds of misery. Again, Petronius summoned the nobles, sometimes begging them, sometimes reminding them of Gaius' rage and of the pressure he himself was under. And for 50 days, the people were idle, since Petronius did not allow them to work or sow. Look, this man has taken his life in his hand by postponing setting up this idol, now by nearly 2 months, while he is in confrontation and conciliating with the nobles, including the emperor, as he can. Remember this, there was no telephone there, fax machine, no computers. If you were going to go back and forth between Rome and, say, Ptolemais, the least it could be done, the least, was 7 days.
You may contact us at Jackson Snyder Presents at this email address, veroyahad@gmail.com. That is veroyahad@gmail.com. And let me remind you, you are listening to Jackson Snyder Presents with your host tonight, Bogdan G. Shrumkov. Thank you for listening. We'll be right back. Jackson Snyder Present is back. Join us now for more of this interesting discussion.
Remember this, there was no telephone there, fax machine, no computers. If you were going to go back and forth between Rome and, say, Ptolemais, the least it could be done, the least, was 7 days. More likely, 30 days it would take to get a message there, 30 days to get it back, somewhere between 7 and 30, depending on the weather, depending on robbers, depending on pirates, depending on a lot of different factors that would delay. But the fastest it could possibly be was a week. When he saw their invincible endurance, Petronius dismissed them, saying, "I must suffer with you. With God's assistance, I will persuade Gaius to consider your wishes and win sweet deliverance together with you. Or, in the event of Caesar's wrath, I'll joyfully give up my life on behalf of so many folk." Then, taking his troops, he marched from Ptolemais to Antioch, and he immediately sent from there to Caesar the news of his arrival and of the Jewish petition. Petronius informed Caesar that if he wished to hang on to the petition and the country and not lose men, he should grant them their desire, that they be permitted to observe their own law. Now, when Gaius received the epistle, he sent Petronius a harsh reply, and he sentenced him to death by the sword, since he was a servant who was sluggish in carrying out his orders. It was quite common in that time for a person of high rank to send a messenger with a reply to a message who also carried the sword to kill him. This is what is happening here. So Gaius is sending an assassin along with the message as to why. So often, these mad emperors would tell the one they were going to kill that they were going to be killed and then delay a short time so that they would be terrorized. Many times also, they were commanded to take their own lives. Such was the case with Petronius at a different time, and also Seneca, the friend of Paul, had to take their own lives, and the emperor would give them a short time to do that. But it happened that those who were taking the letter were drowned at sea. Others arrived first, announcing the death of Gaius. So, saved by the bell. Certainly, as we'll read in the scripture in a few minutes, the hand of the angel of Yahweh was in all this, setting up his plan that had been revealed just to some very important prophets of the first century. Next, we go on to Claudius, another emperor that's mentioned in Acts a couple times. When Gaius Caesar had been murdered, troops seized Claudius, his uncle. Claudius was Germanicus's brother. Claudius had some problems, a bad speech impediment, a limp, some deformation of his limbs. We're not exactly sure what, but everyone thought he was an imbecile, and he wanted it that way, because as long as he was an imbecile in the background, he wouldn't be assassinated like so many others had been assassinated of the family. Claudius lived 10 BC to 54 AD when he was poisoned with a mushroom. The troops seized Claudius, his uncle, to make him emperor, the imbecile. But the elders of the city, the councils, apprehending the commanders Sergius Saturninus and Pomponius Secundus, along with 3 cohorts, that is 150 men, and told them to guard the city. They themselves assembled in the capital, and because of Gaius's irreverence, they planned to fight against Claudius by giving power to 10 judges just as it had been done formerly, that is, in the time of the Republic. So it happened that Herod Agrippa, who also came to life about 10 BC and lasted till 44 AD, Herod Agrippa, who is also in the New Testament in several places, one place we will quote in a minute, Herod Agrippa, who was Caligula's best friend when he was growing up, and a great friend of Claudius. Tiberius put Agrippa in prison, never to get out again. But a prophet of the Essenes in prison prophesied to him, when you see the owl, you'll find your freedom. And when Tiberius died, Gaius pulled Agrippa out of prison and made him king. They used to hobnob together. There are a number of stories about Caligula and King Agrippa, but this King Agrippa was in debt his whole life, had to run from debtors. Like I said, he ended up in prison. He got himself a prophecy of the owl. The second part of that prophecy was, when you see the owl again, that's the day you'll die. So Herod Agrippa was there at the same time in Rome when Gaius was murdered. But realizing that Claudius was now truly emperor, he went to him to be his assistant in case he had need. Oh, look, Claudius would have certainly been murdered. Claudius Caesar sent his servant to the elders to let them know his wishes, namely, that having been seized by the troops, his ascension was against his will. He said, "It is not fitting for me to disdain their zeal, nor will it be good for my life," as he probably drooled. "For it is an awesome thing to succeed to power and receive the title of ruler and then give it up without compulsion. Further, it is not reasonable to create a mortal resentment against oneself by doing so. Thus, I will exercise power as a good protector and not as a tyrant. Let me have the name and dignity of Caesar, and I will then hand matters of administration and justice over to you. Oh, I will be gentle, for I have before me the great example of Gaius' murder." And of course, that is why he played the imbecile his entire life. And these words Agrippa brought to the elders of Rome, and they, relying on the troops and on their virtue and noble descent, answered, "We will not submit to voluntary servitude." When Claudius heard, he sent Agrippa to them, saying, "I cannot betray those who have sworn to me, but I do not fight them by choice, but show me a place outside the city for a battle. It's not right that our malevolence should stain the temple of our fatherland with the blood of those of the same race." So Agrippa reported the whole speech to the elders, and right away one of the soldiers drew his sword and cried out, "Fighting men, what has come over us that we are to kill our brothers, to pick up arms against Claudius' kindred, when we have a Lord beyond reproach, righteous and free of all disgrace?" One that certainly they thought they could manipulate in 100 different ways. And with these words, he departed from their midst and took all his men with him. The citizens had no other way to save themselves but to hasten to Claudius before the troops arrived. And Claudius received them all with joy, honoring and embracing them. He went with them immediately to offer joyful sacrifice to God on his ascension or accession to power. You see, Agrippa had pacified troops, and Claudius gave him all his father's kingdom and added to it the lands of Trachonitis and Auranitis. And apart from these, he handed over to him yet another kingdom, the one Lysanias had ruled. Now, these are all over there in northern Palestine to the east of Galilee, northeast of Galilee. And apart from these, he handed over to him yet another kingdom. He ordered his magistrates that all honors be deposited in the capital to make it known to later generation the honors of Agrippa that he had received from Claudius. You see this close relationship between the imperial family and the Arabian Agrippa, who was Herod the Great's grandson. So Agrippa quickly acquired wealth untold, and at Jerusalem he immediately started to build walls of such a height and thickness as never before. Had he completed them in his own lifetime, the Romans could not have taken Jerusalem by any means. But before the work was finished, he died at Caesarea after a reign of 3 years, having no son. Now, I wonder about that. Josephus says here that he had no son, but we know, or we think we know, that he did. That is Herod Agrippa II, who's also mentioned in the book of Acts. But concerning his own death and concerning his son, he was also called King Agrippa. We have Acts 26 to attest to him. His son came on very young, and he was just a puppet. He had no power whatsoever. The governor of Syria had the power, and those throughout the New Testament times for almost the entire century. Festus, Fadus, Florus, Cumanus. There's another one in Yeshua's time that I can't remember. They were all greedy, bloodthirsty men. So here Agrippa says to Paul, "Can you persuade me in such a short time to become a Christian?" "Short time or long," Paul replied. "I wish to God that not only you, but all who hear me this day may become what I am, except for these chains." Now I have a quote, it's rather lengthy, from the Greek Josephus, because we want to fill in through the death of Agrippa. I think that's the end of it then. But I don't know if anybody, really interested in this, but I am. I'm learning so much, and so much of this Slavonic Josephus is not in the versions we know. So in the Antiquities, book 19, Josephus writes, Now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city Caesarea, which was formerly called Strato's Tower. And there he exhibited spectacles in honor of Caesar, for whose well-being he'd been informed that a certain festival was to be celebrated. At this festival, a great number were gathered together of the principal persons of dignity of his province. On the second day of the spectacles, he put on a garment made wholly of silver, of a truly wonderful texture, and came into the theater early in the morning. There the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays, shone out in a wonderful manner, and was so resplendent as to spread awe over those who looked intently upon him. Presently his flatterers cried out from one place or another, and one and another from another, though not for his good, that he was a god. And they added, Be thou merciful to us, for although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet shall we henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature. Upon this the king neither rebuked them nor rejected their impious flattery, but he shortly afterward looked up and saw an owl sitting on a certain rope over his head, and immediately understood that this bird was the messenger of ill tidings, just as it had been the messenger of good tidings to him. And he fell into the deepest sorrow. A severe pain arose in his belly, striking with the most violent intensity. He therefore looked upon his friends and said, I, whom you call a god, am commanded presently to depart this life, while Providence thus reproves the lying words you just now said to me, and I, who was by you called immortal, am immediately to be hurried away by death. But I am bound to accept what Providence allots, as it pleases God, for we have by no means lived ill, but in a splendid and happy manner. And when he had said this, his pain became violent. Accordingly, he was carried into the palace, and the rumor went abroad everywhere that he would certainly die soon. The multitude sat in sackcloth, men, women, and children, after the law of their country, and besought God for the king's recovery. All places were also full of mourning and lamentation. Now the king rested in a high chamber, and when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life, being in the 54th year of his age, and in the 7th year of his reign. He ruled 4 years under Caius Caesar. 3 of them were over Philip's tetrarchy only, and on the 4th, that of Herod was added to it, and he reigned besides those 3 years under Claudius Caesar, during which time he had Judea added to his lands, as well as Samaria and Caesarea. The revenues that he received out of them were very great, no less than 12 millions of drachma, but he borrowed great sums from others, for he was so very liberal that his expenses exceeded his incomes, and his generosity was boundless. Again, now remember, in this particular version, who Josephus is trying to impress with these speeches. Acts 12:20-23. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Zidon, so they came to him in the body, and after winning over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for a reconciliation because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat on the platform, and delivered a public address to them. The people kept shouting, "The voice of a god and not of a mortal," and immediately, because he had not given the glory to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Now, Agrippa was the last king to have any power with Rome. Agrippa II had no power. He had lived a normal life. Had he lived a normal lifespan, chances are that the Jewish revolt might never have happened, because the imperial clan loved him, and the people of Israel also loved him. Was he really struck down by the angel of Yahweh? Was it this part of Yahweh's plan for what was to come in the next section? Let me ask you if there are any questions or comments. If not, I thank you for coming. I'll do one more here, and we'll go back to Allison if she wants to. So we'll go into the Great Tribulation next time and the actual Jewish war through the Slavonic Josephus. Yes, I do have notes. Yeah, I've got notes for the first one too. They got pictures on them and everything. If you want them, let me know. Yahweh be with you. Amen.
Do you concur?
I concur.
I concur.
I concur.
I concur. Concur. Affirmative. Keep this under your hat until an announcement is made.
Absolutely not. This text has been under hat for way too long as it is. Let's spread the news to those scoffers and minimalists, heathens and sinners, that Yahshua HaMashiach not only lived, that he was and is a man, but by him is the only path to eternal life. Let us spread that news, and then let us rejoice.
Ancient echoes, the music from which is purported to be the earliest music that we have from the Middle East, and that particular one is from Israel. Ancient Echoes, great album. Early Middle East music. Let's go to the Antiquities, Book 19, Chapter 7, Paragraph 4. This is a most interesting paragraph to me in relationship to New Testament studies, and it might just identify another of our New Testament characters. The incident I'm about to describe from Antiquities is from about 40 AD, and let's see if you can guess who this might be speaking of. There was a certain man of the Jewish nation at Jerusalem who appeared to be very accurate in the knowledge of the Torah. His name was Simon, or Shimon. This man got together an assembly while the king, that is Agrippa I, was absent at Caesarea, and had the insolence to accuse him as not living holily, that is, in a holy manner, and that he might justly be excluded out of the temple, since it belonged only to native Jews. You might remember that Agrippa, as one of the Herods, was of course a Herodian, and part of his lineage was Idumean, or Arab. But the general of Agrippa's army informed him that Simon had made such a speech to the people. So the king sent for him, and as he was sitting in the theater, he bid him sit down by him, and said to him with a low and gentle voice, "What is there done in this place that is contrary to the Torah?" But he had nothing to say for himself, but begged his pardon. So the king was more easily reconciled to him than one could have imagined, as esteeming mildness a better quality in a king than anger, and knowing that moderation is more becoming in great men than passion. So he made this Simon a small present and dismissed him. That's the end of the quote. Now consider, who could be this Simon, who was so well versed in the Torah that got himself together an assembly in Jerusalem to get a notice in Josephus, especially of this kind, might mean that this Simon was just not any old Simon. So this Simon is sent for by the king. And can you imagine the concern of that Simon getting this appeal after this Simon had been preaching thither and yon against the king's behavior? And they meet in the theater, that is, a meeting place. We might call it a meeting room. He sits down expecting to be threatened by the king because Agrippa had all power and the power of life or death. But he speaks to him in a low and gentle voice. Just one question. What is there done in this place that is contrary to the Torah? And Agrippa, of course, is speaking of himself. Now, some people had a vendetta against Agrippa because he had built a balcony where he could bring foreigners in, and they could sit on this balcony and see right into the temple, witnessing the sacrifices. And many considered that a breach, and it is written that the zealots built a wall so high that Agrippa could no longer see what was going on in there from his balcony in order to counter the foreigner from seeing the sacrifices. But that wasn't against the law, and so at the question, Simon has to dig for an answer that could mean his life. And what answer did he choose? He chose to apologize. In fact, it says he begged his pardon. And thus, Agrippa gave him a gift and sent him on out. Perhaps then they had, before sending him, a discussion of some kind. But this mention of a Simon who started an assembly in Jerusalem is very curious. Could this be Simon, surnamed Kepha, or as he's called today, Simon Peter? The dating is right. That he was the founder of an assembly is right. And the fact that we have two men sitting together that were both quite humble and contextually mild-mannered. Think about it. Maybe we have identified yet another New Testament personage in Josephus' Antiquities. Bogdan?
Yes, our time is up now for our second installment of the lost book of Josephus. That is the Slavonic Aramaic version. And I don't know you, but I've learned a lot in this series. And there really is nothing I like more than identifying New Testament characters in other contemporaneous literature. And now you can go to bed after having a little glass of wine, a piece of cheese, a morsel of bread, and oh, don't forget to pray for your brother Shroomkopf.